This month in the podcast, we'll be dealing with my hometown, Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, up until about 1989. Now, I'm not interested in talking about the Arkells or Sonic Unyon Records or Supercrawl or Ian Astbury of the Cult, who moved to Hamilton from England when he was 11 in 1973, the year I was born. Funnily enough, Astbury doesn't hold any love for Hamilton, and that's fucking fine. He spent a few years here, maybe got some of the lunch bucket rock and roll in him from 1150 CKOC or something. We don't have much time for people who leave. I'm interested in punk rock and roll. That's Hamilton born and bred. But I think it's important to know a little bit about Hamilton first. Hamilton didn't really exist until the early 1800s. Well, it existed before that due to the existence of Six Nations prior to Western settlers, but they didn't call it Hamilton. It probably owes its existence to the famous Battle of Stony Creek, where the British fought off the American invasion forces during the War of 1812, and as Canadians we like to pump up the fact that we beat the Americans once until their culture took us over. This is important in Canada's formation as we sort of align more with British ideals and outlooks and ethics rather than the American ones that are seen south of the border. It's one of our defining traits, minus the rampant colonization, because we too were a colony for most of our existence. Hamilton didn't become a fully fledged city until 1846. Pre-World War I, the Industrial Revolution boosted Hamilton's economic growth, and manufacturing became a part of our identity as a city. That hard working class sort of ethic, a lunch bucket brigade, if you will. Hamilton also had a seedy underbelly, as the mafia in the city were well connected after masterminding bootlegging operations that ran across Lake Ontario into New York State during Prohibition times. As with the manufacturing booms elsewhere post-World War II and into the 60s, Hamilton's prosperity benefited. But as manufacturing moved overseas or into the U.S. and Mexico, Hamilton's prosperity also never recovered. Downtown became less attractive as the giant Jackson Square was placed in the heart of downtown, bulldozing hundreds of buildings dating back to the early part of the century that, if proposed today, would probably have been met with great outrage. In the mid-70s, the economy hit another major recession, and that's where I'll take my first detour to where the flying saucers are landing.
Okay, here's some heavy metaloid music. It's called Legal Bodies. It's a song of the future. It's when, unless you have a metal body, they're not going to allow you to walk the streets. No kidding. I'll tell you everything I am. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm sorry I missed your train. I'm so bad and happy, hope it happens again. If it happens again, you're just gonna have to hold your breath and you're gonna have to, oh, you know, you're gonna have to hold your breath and count it back. By the time you hear this song, your nose and your ears are gonna be pointed all wrong. Just play it cool and you won't end up with 3 time losing 4. Hey, know there's a place I ought to be. Inside the brain of a cyborg. I don't know what I mean. I don't know what I'm talking about. Thank you. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Now, that song was recorded in 1975 on the top of Jackson Square, a mall in downtown Hamilton perched at the corner of King and James. Simply Saucer are much like the Velvet Underground, who played Hamilton in 1966, but, for Hamilton. Incredibly crucial, but criminally underrated until recently. Edgar Bro, the main guitarist and songwriter for Simply Saucer, did an interview with Q on CBC in 2008 about playing on the roof of Jackson Square.
Well, some of it was like the curiosity seekers are out there looking at, wondering what that barrage of sound signified. And there were friends and, fans from the city that were there. And I just remember being very on that day, Yeah. It was all happening for us on stage.
It's interesting to note that Simply Saucer, who operated in a sci-fi, and continue to operate in a sci-fi motif, really were articulating some of the things that we're talking about in society in 2018. Surveillance, technology, and alienation. This was released on the B-side of Cyborgs Revisited, the first compilation LP that came out in 1989, and has been re-released a couple of times, I think, since then. Simply Saucer were Hamilton's first punk band, although they may not be the best known one. For that, let's move on to the next batch of punk bands, who also started in the 70s.
Someday you remember me and picture my face. Someday you may smile at me and I walk away. But yesterday I needed a book, today I need a bank. But I know who was always there. It's me that I have to thank. And I won't say I picture my face, and I gotta say a kiss on my face. Someday you remember me and picture my face. Someday you may smile at me and I walk away. Yesterday I needed love, today I need some hate. But I know who was always there. Now baby, it's too late. And I wanna say I picture my face, and I gotta say a kiss on my face. And I wanna say a kiss on my face, and I wanna say a picture my face. I need somebody new, just like you. I need somebody true. I need somebody new, just like you. I want somebody too. And I won't say I picture my face, and I won't say baby bye bye.
Shouldn't try and tell me about your history. 'Cause when I look at you, you know that I can't see. That you're having too much fun at every party. Because you're only hanging best in town. You cover up, you don't last long. The mess you're in is too far gone. You look up, you look down. You think you're it, the best in town. You cover up, but it won't last too long. You stayed in your nest just a bit too long. But the dope that you didn't last that long. So then you met little Julie and she paid the bill. So now you and your mess will never be gone. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, it won't last long. The mess you're in is too far gone. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, but it won't last too long. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, it won't last long. The mess you're in is too far gone. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, but it won't last too long. So in the future that's ahead of me now, it'll be a bit crooked, even worse than now. And the ones that keep you going might not be around. So then you and the mess will be kissing the ground. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, it won't last long. The mess you're in is too far gone. You look up, you look down. You think you're in, the best in town. You cover up, but it won't last too long. It won't last too long. But that mess you're in, you know it's too far gone. You better stop sleeping.
One, two, three, four. I like the name tattooed in your toes. I like the start running out of your nose. I like the stance on your hand to go. The clothes are funny when I hold the phone. I don't even know some true. I know why you know why you're in. I know when you're having such a nice so bad. I really are. I'm fuck me that. Really are. I'm not ready for every new girl's another 3 day after. You gotta be careful of the color of their hair. Those are really right, this is what she told. I'm in the measure sealed, I do okay. I go with you when you be away. Lying there stiff for his time to play. Can't wait till the undertaker goes away. Laying upside down when you get your drain. That's an damn pleasure of the lowering scene. And it's my large as a story. So baby, I love it when you fuck me dead. Baby, I love it when you fuck me dead. We knew girls another 3 day after. Well, be careful of the poor little man. Doesn't really matter what she's too late to go. Doesn't really matter because she runs to go. Maybe all hope to rise. Maybe all hope to rise. Maybe I love it when you fuck me back. Maybe I love it when you fuck me back. Maybe I love it when you fuck me back.
that set, I played Teenage Head, Picture My Face, off their first and self-titled LP. Teenage Head have a long history. Still currently playing. They started playing at Westdale's high school cafeteria in 1975, then quickly started to gig around at the time of punk's ascent. They were crucial in early punk formation here in southern Ontario. They were clearly influenced by a lot of early rock and roll like Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, Flamin' Groovies, which is where they got their name. They were also clearly listening to the Stooges, New York Dolls, and MC5. Now, it's crucial to understand what Hamilton was like in the 70s for music, and even though it's starting to pitch itself as a music city today, it's not particularly got a rich history of supporting music. Simply Saucer, Teenage Head's contemporary, discussed how they played the YMCA, the Downtown Mall rooftop, and rented halls in a 2008 interview with Lou Molinaro on his radio show Losing Control. But club gigs were scarce. The ones that they did play got Saucer kicked out after a few songs or threatened with violence. Teenage Head didn't get the same sort of visceral reaction to their songs, unless you're counting the riots that happened, but certainly found that a lack of places to play in Hamilton had a severe impact on their ability to get their name out. Both Simply Saucer and Teenage Head were not interested in being punk bands per se, or being part of the Toronto scene, but there was nothing else. With that said, there's something about Hamilton identity around hard work, whether you're from the steel mill or playing rock and roll. From an interview with Frankie Venom, the singer of Teenage Head, that aired on CBC's primetime radio show hosted by Jeff Pevere.
So there were limited venues, especially for our type of music.
Yeah.
A lot of club owners were skeptical because they had heard, that we'd cause a little, people to get drunk and fight and dance and slam dancing,
Yeah.
what that was, right? It was real rampant and wild at the time. So Hamilton really wanted no part of us. So we moved. We all moved to Toronto.
So there was no hometown support for the band in the
Not
early days
really,
at all?
no. As a matter of fact, when we were presented a gold album, we gave it to City Hall, and they put it up in the foyer. 2 weeks later, somebody ripped it off. So, I don't know. I'm not putting Hamilton down. I love Hamilton, but no, there was just no places to play. The kids wanted to see us, but what could we do? We couldn't build a club, so we had to move,
When you were looking out there in the early days and you felt this whole thing taken off, who were you looking at? Who was out there? Who were the first audiences?
Gosh, anybody that could sneak in, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody. There was like university people. There were young kids. It was just, it was crazy. People would come out and get really, really impaired and slam dance. And I don't think they really cared about the music at the time, But then once we had product released, then we realized, hey, they were eating it up. So it was great. No regrets at all.
That was Frankie Venom, singer of Teenage Head. The band saw their popularity skyrocket after the second LP, Frantic City, was released in 1980, and the single Something on My Mind was making waves on radio charts across Canada, not just within southern Ontario. In the middle of July, the band played Ontario Place with some unforeseen circumstances. From the same interview, here's Frankie Venom talking about the Ontario Place riot.
1980, June 2nd, my birthday.
Mm-hmm.
We had a single on the radio at the time, which was basically a love ballad. It was soft with acoustics. It was called Something on My Mind, and I think it was #1 on CKOC in Hamilton. But anyways, a lot of young kids couldn't see the band because we were basically playing the pubs. So when we played Ontario Place, it was free and obviously open to all ages. So all these young kids who had heard the song on the radio, I think they said there was 15,000 people there. Apparently they all rushed to Ontario Place to see us because it was their only opportunity. And they shut the gates because the place was so full. Well, we were on stage. We didn't see what was going on, but apparently there was 2,000 people or 3,000 locked outside the gates. So they just crashed the gates. Next thing, all hell broke loose and started fighting with police and trashing cruisers and tipped over a streetcar and what have you, swam across the moats. But like I say, we were on stage. We had no idea. We were oblivious to it.
Yeah.
The next day, we saw the front page of The Sun, band causes riot, and we sold like 10,000 albums in 3 days after that, so it was great. No regrets at all. Yeah, we shut Ontario Place down for rock and roll for the summer. Proud of it.
The reputation of Teenage Head as hard-working and hard-partying, well, that came through loud and clear. Teenage Head continued to play through addiction issues, Frankie leaving the band in the mid-80s to be replaced by Dave Rave, to Frankie returning in the early 90s and beyond, and then Frankie's death in 2008. Almost anyone in Hamilton has a Frankie Venom story, some good, some problematic. We can chalk both up to whatever demons Frankie had in him. As a performer, he's pretty much untouchable, but often when you are able to perform at such heights, there is a downside. Frankie was an alcoholic and an addict at times, which is pretty typical of Hamilton. He also has said and done some things that don't paint him in a particularly good light. With all that said, I think Teenage Head's music certainly speaks for itself, despite its troubled lead singer. There's a book out called The Gods of the Hammer, which is all about Teenage Head. It's a quick, easy read. It's a good primer. You could also read Sam Sutherland's book on early punk and hardcore, or read Treat Me Like Dirt, which is another oral history of early punk in Toronto, essentially. But you'll notice here that Hamilton bands have a big role to play in Toronto's development. Speaking of Toronto, Dream Dates were next, and probably weren't as closely associated with Hamilton as mostly they played Toronto. This is a recurring theme we'll see throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. But Dream Dates are a Hamilton band through and through. Lasting only a short while, the drummer went on to drum for other Hamilton bands, Slander and the Forgotten Rebels, while the singer Greg Dick eventually moved to Toronto and played in a dozen or so more bands. He finally escaped Hamilton's East End. The 1979 recordings didn't surface until later in 2000, starting with a couple of singles being released by Ugly Pop Records out of Toronto. Now, Hamilton is a city split between two ends, the East End and the West End. The East End is where all the industrial steel plants are, and a lot of the East End was made up of working-class families. And those people tend to have a lunch bucket attitude, which was a very famous, locally famous book in the 70s, documenting photos of Hamilton's working class. The West End, or Westdale, is closer to McMaster University, or MAC, and tended to be a more affluent or at least middle-class area. Traditionally, the two geographic regions had their own sort of culture, and rarely did the two meet, but it's important to note that the Dream Dates and many of Hamilton's punk bands drew on members from both Westdale and the East End. Punk and the music sort of superseded any sort of cultural tribal notions. It was really interesting. If Teenage Head were the most important band out of Hamilton, Forgotten Rebels were definitely the most notorious. Mickey DeSatis' approach to writing lyrics, which involved putting himself into a character and voicing that character, has often led folks to wonder if the band is racist or anti-immigration or anti-homosexual or just plain offensive. The band is not racist or homophobic, but the lyrics often take on the viewpoints of those sorts of people to take the piss out of them. At times, that has worked against the Rebels' favor. The Rebels put out two releases in the 70s, the 1977 Tomorrow Belongs to Us EP and the In Love with the System LP in 1979. I played Fuck Me Dead, which is off Tomorrow Belongs to Us. An important side note, Tomorrow Belongs to Us came out on Star Records, which is the most important record store at the time for early punks. Lastly, I played the Shakers, who were a power pop band, and you might not think that power pop and punk are aligned. I think they are, and here's my rationale for that. At the time, the 70s, mostly disco and prog rock were these sorts of 1-2 punch of what's on the radio. So anything sort of harkening back to that 50s and 60s style of rock and roll would have easily been lumped in. If you listen to the Shakers, they're pretty close to things like Pointed Sticks, Tirana, other bands of that sort of nature that were playing on the poppier edge of punk. And you could even say that the Ramones have a bit of a poppy punk kind of thing going on. I think it all comes down to how the guitars are situated in the band and how much distortion they have. I think if you play a power pop song with way more distortion, you've got a really good punk band. So, much like the Nerves from the U.S., but with a slightly harder edge, the Shakers were the first band of Dave Rave, who later went on to sing for Teenage Head in Frankie Venom's absence, and is currently the singer for Teenage Head after, there was another singer after Frankie's death, but won't talk about him. And Tim Gibbons, who's a local bluegrass artist who's played on a few notable Hamilton bands post the Shakers. The Shakers existed between 79 and 82, which is a perfect segue into the 80s.
Walking down the street, looking kinda mean. Standing at the bus stop, thinking I'm 15. Getting on the bus cause I can't afford a car. And going downtown to my favorite bar. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. 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 The girls are dressed to kill, and they give me such a thrill. You gotta understand, they're here to see the band. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street. Let's go. Get to my feet, feeling kinda beat. Thought I'd take a walk up and down the street. If I walk too far, gonna steal myself a car and drive back down to my favorite bar. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street. The girls are dressed to kill, and they give me such a thrill. You gotta understand, they're here to see the band. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. Rocking on Main Street. Let's go. Rocking on Main Street, Main Street. 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 Rocking on Main Street, Main Street.
Hey, Mom, grab a pizza sub. Eat it in a hurry, that's at the club. They ask me why I'm never at home. They want to piss my
gentlemen, mowing the lawn.
So in that set, I started off with Slander. Slander, like the Dream Dates, were from Hamilton, but played a lot in Toronto, which has been sort of the history of Hamilton for punk. Anyways, there's always been a lack of venues for punk bands up until, really, in the past maybe decade. Slander were late getting in and late getting started, but really exemplify how Hamilton was late to kind of hardcore. This album came out in 1981, but it sounds like it belongs in 1977. So somebody once said, I think it's Greg Dick in an interview with Equalizing Distort, said that hardcore came late to Hamilton, and it was 1982 before anyone sort of knew what hardcore was. It's kind of an interesting thing. This kind of has that sort of rougher edge, more Stooges-y than Sex Pistols-y. Kind of really reminds me of the sort of thing that Hamilton bands tend to do, have this heavy sort of quality to them. Talk more about that in the 2000s. It makes them also a perfect bridge band between punk and hardcore, so maybe Slander were perfectly situated. I played Problem Children next, playing what might be the most well-known song by them, called Thrashing with Your Parents. I took this version from their LP, but you're likely to have heard it on the Flipside compilation that it appeared on. This album, The Future of the World Is Up to Us, came out in 1986, just as I was getting into punk rock, so Problem Children hold a very special place in my heart. Problem Children are probably the most well-traveled of the punk bands, doing several U.S., Canadian, and European tours, maybe topped by Cursed or Chokehold, but we'll talk about them later. They were incredibly workaholic, and Problem Children were the first DIY punk band in Hamilton. They set up their own record label to release their own records, do their own distribution, connected hundreds of bands to Hamilton. So there's a huge, huge, huge debt of respect that we need to pay to Jamie Problem. This is a bit of a cheat, and I'll come clean here. Jamie's actually from Dunnville, which is a very, very small town outside of Hamilton. And I'm sure Dunvillians would hate to be called Hamiltonians, and Hamiltonians hate to be called anything but Hamiltonians. So, but I know Jamie is a Hamiltonian through and through. He just lives in Dunnville, or lived anyways. After that, I played the Dick Van Dykes, who, much like many punk bands at the late 80s, early 90s, were satirical, and I played the song Curling, which again is probably their most well-known song. Not particularly well-known outside of Hamilton or the Southern Ontario region, but definitely a band with some staying power. They did well on the local college radio station CFMU, and they just recently played a one-off sort of reunion. I think it was a wedding of someone in the band, and they basically got up and played 5 songs, and it was really good from what I've been told. They played sort of on the fringes of punk rock and college rock. With that term at the time, college rock was this thing that would probably be called indie rock today. In the late 80s, you had your mainstream music and you had other stuff, and anything that wasn't on a mainstream major label thing was seen as punk, or could be seen as punk anyways. If it sort of had guitars and drums, and there was a lot of sort of gray area. It wasn't easy to define what punk was, and as it shouldn't be. I always thought that the Dick Van Dykes, growing up anyways, I got into punk, and I was a self-righteous political humorless is maybe a good way to describe it. I was serious, and so bands that weren't making strong political statements didn't really resonate with me until much later in my years when I came to appreciate them. So with that sort of hindsight, Dick Van Dykes are definitely a punk band. Next, I played the Wet Spots, who at the time annoyed the ever-loving shit out of me. When I was a self-righteous political punk in 1986 and 87 and up until probably 10 years ago. With the benefit of the years since, they still bother me, but at least I understand what they were trying to do. Stay 19 is from the album Waking Up with the Wet Spots, and I have to say that the band's output is a solid example of what I lovingly call meat and potatoes hardcore. It won't blow you away, but it's a good listen when it comes on. Lastly, I played Rabid Defiance Children's Always Suffer, which appeared on the Canacor compilation tape from 1988, but also was on a demo tape of theirs that I believe I got later in 1990 or so. I'm not sure if it's just the demo with more songs on the B-side or a mistake or what. So I'm sure next time I'll talk to somebody in the band, I'll get cleared up on that. Or maybe not. They probably don't know either. It was literally almost 20 years ago. For me, Rabid Defiance were one of those bands that didn't end up making much of an impact with the band itself, but they did make it as people. They were the sort of linchpin people that made shows happen. They opened shows. For me, they were one of the only examples of a local political band, and that, to me, was a crucial piece of what punk rock is. They also were the first band, and maybe this is embarrassing myself a little bit, that I saw that wasn't made up entirely of white dudes. And that was kind of mind-blowing at the time. More importantly, though, Rabid Defiance were my gateway band into BCT tapes, as Craig was destroying them in international hardcore, and turned me on to some really, really good stuff. Those BCT tapes opened my mind to Raw Power and a whole bunch of Italian hardcore that I would never have discovered. And I still, look at some of those BCT tapes and the stuff that he's done with Schizophrenic Records and just, kind of go, wow. When I started booking shows periodically in 1989, I wanted to pay them back and got them to play with the likes of Oi Polloi, Born Against, Anti-Schism, Iconochrist in the early 90s in Hamilton. So I hope I could pay back some of that debt that I feel towards Rabid Defiance. Speaking of the 90s, that's a future podcast. And frankly, it's one that needs its own entire episode, because in 1990 it seemed like Hamilton sort of blossomed into this underground punk network, and which exists to this day. More importantly, one of Canada's greatest hardcore bands lit off some fireworks and almost blew up immediately. For this month, I'm John Krutoff, and this podcast has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit General Admission blog on Medium at medium.com/general-admission. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's Gen ADM Show, so GENADMSHOW on Twitter. If you're old, an email, generaladmissionshow@gmail.com. If you didn't like this podcast, in the words of the amazing Big Boys, go make your own.